Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage, Matt Hixson.
Good morning. So I was asked to come speak about influence here. And whenever I was first asked that, I thought, well, either people in the audience are going to be really excited or they're going to throw things at me because it's such a controversial topic these days. And so before I get into that, I want to kind of understand who you guys are. So how many of you work directly for a brand? Okay. How many of you do consulting, work in an agency, help brands with social media? Okay. And how many of you are vendors? Because I know there's some of those out there too. Okay. So now how many of you work in B2B? Okay. And B2C? All right. I figured that I had the wrong one there. Thank you. And now how many of you, just out of curiosity, have been doing this for less than a year? Really, and what I mean here is you've been working in social media for your business, not that you've had a Facebook account for 5 years talking to your friends, but you've been doing this in business for a year. Okay, 2 years? More than 3 years? Okay, cool. Great audience. So to give you perspective as to why I'm up here, I wanted to give you a little bit of background about me. So in 2008, I was working for a company called Tripwire in Portland, Oregon, which is where I'm from. And I was asked to go run a startup within the company. I said, great, we can go do that. And it was a whole new market. It was in the virtualization market, which is now what you hear about the cloud. And it was interesting. What we quickly discovered was, as I was out there trying to figure out, okay, who are the experts in this field? Who should we talk to? Because we'd never been in this field before. And what we quickly found was this audience and this community was all using Twitter as their back channel. And this was back in 2008 when I think when I joined Twitter, I don't know, it was less than 2 million people on Twitter, something like that. And so I took my team and I gave them all a second monitor on their desk and I said, you're going to have this thing called TweetDeck on there. And they all thought I was completely insane. I said, we're going to listen to this conversation. We had no idea what we were doing, to be honest with you. And so we listen to this conversation and we start seeing these people interacting, right? And we start watching the conversation. And what we started to realize was these are the guys that are the experts, right? These are the guys that are writing blogs that are getting millions of hits. And these are the people that VMware is looking for to talk about their stuff. And we were building relationships with these folks. We were just flying by the seat of our pants trying to figure it out. And we were building relationships and eventually, by the time we launched, we got a chance to have them, some of the best bloggers in the world, write blog posts about us. And I had a chance to sit down with one of those guys a few years later, and I said, you know, you have to get hundreds and hundreds of requests to talk on your blog every day. Why in the hell did you spend 5 days writing a review of our product that nobody had ever bought at that point? And he said, well, because you're my friends, because we built a relationship. And this was back in 2008 when that was a little easier to scale. But if you think about what we do in social media, we sit there and we watch this channel go by and we're trying to figure out who's friends with who and who has a relationship and who the cliques are. It's like high school all over again, right? I mean, you're sitting there watching all these things and what I really want to break down for you guys today, at least my perspective of it is, why do we think we need influence? What does it mean today? And where do we go beyond that? And so, unfortunately, this is a topic I think way too much about. And so I just want to give you that perspective. And along the way here in this journey, actually when I was at that startup, I met my co-founder, Nitin Minde, who's in the audience somewhere, back in the back there. And he has been studying this type of information for the last 7 or 8 years as part of his PhD. And so we met along the way and decided that this crazy picture that I kept drawing all over the building, he had an answer to. Now, what I was trying to figure out with this picture was the fact that I knew it's, you know, if any of you have done network diagrams, things like that, that's all I was drawing, right? It's nothing special. But what I kept trying to articulate to the marketing team was, hey, we're watching these people, and I don't really care about who follows who or any of that stuff. What I care about is, how do these people relate? Like, who are the people that like each other? Who are the people that talk to each other? Because, you know, when we're thinking about influencers, that's what we're really trying to figure out, right? We're trying to figure out, where do I spend my time as a business? And I think that's where the personal aspect and the business aspect separate a little bit is, how many of you that work in a brand and that do social media, this is one of your jobs? Really? How many of you are dedicated to this job full time? Okay, so not as many hands. So here was the story I got whenever I left the startup within this company and went into the bigger company. I said, we've got to do social media. And they said, well, why? And I said, well, there's a whole community of people talking about what we do in our audience on social media. And they're hanging out on Twitter. This IT security market was the market I was in. And I said, we need to spend time and resources there. And I wasn't in the marketing department, but I felt passionate about it from my past experience. And so she said, well, great. You get no budget, and you get no resources. So good luck. I said, okay. So we went off and did that for a few years, and we made progress, but I still had this problem. I still want to understand what this model looked like, because if you think about it, we're all building our own mental model of this thing, right? Who likes who interacts with who, and I wanted to know a better answer about that, and that's where we started Tellagence, and so that's what I'm working on for the past year. So as a marketer, our objective is to reach an audience, right? I mean, we've been given a business objective, and we're told to go create awareness, create leads, create sales, whatever your objective may be. But the whole point is, you've got to take that business objective, and you've got to create a strategy. You've got to turn that strategy into some sort of tactics, a campaign, an event, whatever that may be, and you've got to reach your audience, right? So you've got to identify that audience, and you've got to reach it. And so I want to walk through a couple slides that is just kind of the base of the talk, and you may go, yeah, well, duh, but this was kind of an enlightening thing for me to realize, because I think we skip a few steps in social media today. So if you have a campaign that you decide you're going to run, and you decide you're going to use direct mail, for example, right? You control the content. So your objective is to create the most amazing piece of content that it sticks out in my mailbox of 100 other things where I actually want to pick it up and read it and respond to it. So when you think about so you have all control over creating that content. The question is how do you get it to your audience, right? So you have a list, you buy a list of names to identify your audience, right? You either have a database or a list that you buy or whatever it is. But actually the Postal Service is the company that moves your information to your audience, right? And their job is to efficiently do that. Now, and I don't know how the Canadian Post is, but in the US they suck at this, right? They've taken on this job, but they don't do it very profitably, right? They're not very good at it. But the objective here is to make money, right? So they've found a niche that they're like, I will move your information to your audience for you. So let's take another example. So a website, you create a blog post. There's lots of ways you get your content to your audience, but the main way you do that today is through search, right? So Google, Bing, Yahoo, whoever. Google made $12 billion last year doing this. Right? Don't fool yourself that they do anything else. Everything they do is to do this. It is to move your content, to find it on the web, to index it, and to move it to your audience. So if you look at these two here, and then you ask yourself, well, okay, in social media, I can sign up for Twitter. I can create the most amazing piece of content ever, and I can put it out to my audience. Right? I can push the tweet button. But I was at a conference a couple weeks ago, and Ryan Sarver, who is he's the director of platforms at Twitter, said, hey, we take a lot of pride at Twitter in the fact that our platform is really simple. That's true. Anybody can sign up for it. You can create a tweet. It's really easy. A lot of you are doing it right now. The question is, how do you move that tweet to your audience, right? Now, if you look at the two examples above, these are billion-dollar industries that have made their living off of moving your content in these forms to your audience, right? Now, when you come into social media, the question is, how do you do this? Now, any of you that have been doing this for a while know, well, okay, yeah, I find relationships and I find friends. But think about this from a business perspective. You guys have a limited budget. You have limited time. The question is you have to basically create that like a business like Google and them have. You have to efficiently move your information to the audience you want. And that's the challenge for us, right? So when I did this back in the startup I was mentioning before, we went off and we found bloggers and we said, okay, that guy seems relevant and he has a Twitter account, so I'm going to go watch him, and now I'm going to see who he talks to, and I'm going to go through his list of followers. And it's like you're just searching, right? You're trying to find these people. And there's a lot of great tools out there today that actually help you find this audience. But the point is that it was random, right? I was trying the best I could because there wasn't a more efficient way for me to do it. And I think that's where we've gotten to the point, at least in my perspective of the influencer, right? As a business, we're saying, well, hey, there's somebody over there who's already collected this huge audience that I don't have to go collect. So how do I tap into them? Because this is about efficiency. right? If you put it in the model of those other two businesses, it's about doing this at a profit, right? So how do I spend my time to get the maximum output with the least amount of input I have to do? Because you know what, I got a lot of other things to do. And so the question becomes, you know, the dreaded whole social ROI question. But to me, I think that that's part of the conversation, which is we look at it just as the campaigns that we run today, and you really have to break it apart in two things. You're building an asset, which is your network of relationships, that when you put out that tweet, not that they follow you, not that anything like that, but they actually give a crap about what you said, right? And so what I'm going to walk through a couple things is some of those elements that we've got to think about. So does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So start with the definition of influence. I actually thought this was really interesting because somebody brought it up to me a while back. You know, influence and influencer and influential and all that stuff is one of those words that's just become really overused. And it's become one of those words that we all know we need to do something that's influence. But when you really take a look at the definition, it's this ability or power to be a compelling force that produces an effect on actions, behaviors, and opinions, right? So it's not that you are an influencer, it's your ability to create a force on somebody else. And I think actually the most interesting thing about this definition is that it says on actions, behaviors, opinions, right? So as a business, we need to first stop and ask, which one of those do we actually want to do? And what exactly is that? Because in order to measure this appropriately, you have to know, do I want to have them click on something? Do I want to have them share this? Do I want to have them do all those things? Do I want to have them share it to a certain audience? Like all those things, the different elements that you pick have a big impact on which one of these it is. So influence is a hot topic, and but I think it's one of those things that you have to consider is a relative term. So whenever I say I'm influential or you're influential, what you really care about as a business, what you're trying to find is who's the most influential, right? Who's the best person, because that's who I should spend my time with. So influence is an attribute of somebody. It's like saying this guy's tall, right? Yeah, this guy may be tall, but are you hanging out with a group of 7-foot basketball players? Then you might not be so tall. Or are you hanging out with a bunch of 5-year-olds? Yeah, you're tall. Congratulations, right? So influence is a metric that's one of those things that's only relative to the people that are you around. So that brings me to the point of really context. So there's a lot of tools out there, and there's a lot of ways that everybody that is selling you a social monitoring platform or whatever has an influence metric. There are influence metric specialists out there, you know, all these types of things. But I think the first thing you have to start with is how do you identify that audience? So all of us, this is actually my best version of me that I could do, not the picture, but the circles. So all of us have different interests. How many of you have lots of different interests on social media that you combine into one account? Okay, how many of you segregate your interests into separate personalities online? Okay, yeah. So for me, I don't do that. I am who I am online, and these are actually all my interests. And what's interesting about this is if you look at the Cloud circle, 3 years ago, when I was in that startup, that would have been the main circle in the middle. And those were all my relationships. And so the point of this is context. I don't really care about your friends and your followers, to be honest with you. What I care about is what relationships that you build with somebody. And so as your interests change and your context change, your relationships change. And so what you have to start with from the very beginning is, well, what audience am I trying to reach? And then looking at someone and their perspective of that audience. So for example, you and I may have a lot in common in social media marketing, right? And we may have a relationship there. But if all of a sudden we start talking about parenting, you know, I'm a father of 3, there's other people that are, you know, parents in here, but just because we're in the same room and because we may follow each other on Twitter, if we never talk about that, we don't have a relationship on parenting. And so when I say something about parenting, you're probably not going to listen to me, right? And so this is really about context, and you really have to understand context first because we all have different roles that we play and different levels of interest and different relationships we build based on those interests. And so if you don't start with context, you're kind of not starting in the right place. So today, influence is really, it's an individual metric, which is one of the things that I think we're really missing here. And what influence really looks at mostly, and just as really to generalize, is really about how one individual's activity can push stuff out. I think we all know if you've been working with some of these influence metrics, there's ways to manipulate them, right, for the most part that are out there today. You can increase your activity, you can do certain things, and you can increase those things. But the actual pushing of information out to your audience is only half the story. You have to have somebody on the other end that's willing to accept it. And this is actually an interesting concept, and because it's like there's the behavior that we're focused on about how can I push stuff out, and there might be the behavior that says, well, I pushed a bunch of stuff out and I got a bunch of retweets. But that's a generic thing. What you really care about as a business and you're trying to reach this audience is, well, who actually cared about receiving that information, right? And as they start to talk and they start to interact over time, they start to build a relationship. So if you and I follow up with each other after this and we start talking about social media, we start building a relationship. And if we talk about that every day from now on, we start to build a pretty strong relationship. And then whenever I talk about social media or whatever it may be, you might actually care, right? Because you trust me, you've built a relationship. This is no different than in the physical world, right? And if we talk today and we walk out of here today and never talk again, our relationship declines pretty fast. It decays and it goes away. So relationships are dynamic, right? So now let's add a different complexity to this. So let's add a third person, right? So the bottom example is pretty simple. You had a third person, and this woman in the blue speaks to the woman in the red, and she says something about social media, let's say. She may not care, right? He says something to her. She may not care. But now if they both say something, she might care. So there's all these dynamics that are way beyond just your activity and your behaviors about how you push. What you also have to consider is the behaviors of somebody and their ability to accept information, right? So you might be in a context that says, in social media, there may be a group of people that you listen to, and it's like, if they say something, I'm watching, right? But if not, if they don't say it, then there might be other people that you may have to hear it 5, 6, 10, 20 times before you actually care, right? And you may have to hear it from the right combination of people and the right number of times. So it gets a lot more complicated than we have today, right? Now, if you expand this is a really simple example. Now, expand this out to this. This is a graph of 5,000 people, right? And we draw these graphs, using a simple tool that a lot of people have access to. But what we really look at is we look at the ability, the blue dots are basically people, and the lines in between them are the relationships they form. But now, if you take that example I just gave you about how people interact with each other, the question becomes, wow, that becomes complicated really fast, right? And so this idea that we're only talking about influence as a push mechanism is only part of the story. And so what you have to do as a business is you're trying to figure out, well, first of all, do I know about all this mess, right? Have I identified my audience? And second of all, how do I actually get to them efficiently? And like I said before, I think what we're doing today is we're looking for influencers. But there's another piece to this, and actually, I'm trying to get through this so we can have a conversation and ask some questions, because this is a topic that a lot of people have opinions on. So there's another thing, and this is actually a client that we work with. They're a Fortune 500 client, and they're interested in this little niche community. And they have a pretty good hold on the core community, but there's also this idea of, usually when I get to this point, people go, oh, you're looking for influencers. I say, okay, but what I really care about is what's the right combination of people, right? So there's roles that people play in these things. So take this person right here, for example. Her name is K-Su-K. She doesn't have many followers. She has about, I forget what it is at the time, like 50 maybe. She doesn't have a high influencer score on any of those metrics. But what she has in the context of this conversation and this topic, she has the right set of relationships. Now, the reason that she has the right set of relationships, and this is actually an easy one to see, is why I pulled it out of here. But the reason she has the right set of relationships is because she controls how information in that upper left-hand group gets to the main core, right? On all normal metrics that you would look at, she has no relevance in this at all. But what you really have to think about is, how do people move information? What roles do they play? So I'll go back to the high school example. You know, one of my favorite examples and one of my favorite movies is Ferris Bueller. Anybody know Ferris Bueller? Yeah? Okay. So think about Ferris Bueller, right? The word of mouth that spread across that high school about Ferris was dying and all this stuff. And, you know, Ferris wasn't friends with everybody. He was friends with the right people, right? And he had the ability to have that word of mouth travel across that organization. And as businesses, the real challenge for us is, how do we efficiently do that? So if you go back to this model, the question is, in social media, is you have to break this into a couple parts, right? One is, yes, you're going to run content and you're going to run campaigns. We know how to do that as marketers. We've been trained to do that for years and years and years. The thing that nobody's doing for you, that there's billion-dollar industries and all that other place, is nobody's building a network of relationships for you. Now the challenge becomes, as any of you that have done this for a while knows, is that doesn't scale, right? At some point, I just can't touch enough people for them to care about what I'm saying and me to genuinely respond to them. So the idea is, well, how do we get more leverage on that? And we've gone to influencers. And what I'm proposing is that there's actually something beyond that, right? You have to, and the problem is that today that's hard to quantify, but it's coming. There's a lot of people working on these types of problems. And as you think about a business, the whole objective is you have to build genuine relationships. That's what social's about. If you push information, if you treat it like a funnel, and you push information through that system, you're just going to piss people off. And they're eventually just not going to like you anymore. And what you really want to do is figure out a way to engage them through those existing trusted relationships. And that, today, we have influence, and that's an incremental approach. But in the future, we're going to have the ability to figure out that right group of people. And that's an exponential approach to reach these audiences. And I think this is a key to me for businesses as to how we actually truly engage in social media and scale it. So with that, I have 3 minutes to spare, and I have plenty of time for questions. So, sorry, I was too fast for you. Yes, I'll bring that next time.
I was just checking questions. So we had a couple of great questions that came through.
Sure.
Let's have a look here. One was from KWestPR, who wanted to know, do you define influencer and brand ambassador differently?
So I think it comes back to whenever I put the definition of influence up there, an influencer, right? To me, the whole conversation about influencers become, if you go back to that slide about moving your content to your audience, right? I'll be honest with you, I don't know that I really care about influencer. What I care about is efficiently moving that information to my audience. If you want to call them an influencer, that's fine. And I think as in social media, a lot of times we talk about content and it's about a subject. And so I don't know that they're the same thing, because what I care about in an influencer is the ability to move my content to my audience, and it's not always going to be branded content, right? But what I want to do is provide compelling content, like Amber was talking about a lot, which is add some value to your community in a way that they'll move that information out for you. And then the people that are really diehard about your brands, those people that you want to build those direct relationships with, yeah, you should turn those into brand advocates. You should do a lot to build those really strong relationships with them. So hopefully that answers that.
I actually had a question about context and platforms, because you talk about context and relationships and topics, but when it comes to the distribution of information through platforms like Facebook or Twitter, obviously they're distributed in different ways to different audiences. How would you weigh that when it comes to determining where the influence lies, for lack of a better term?
Sure. If I understand the question, so you're saying that there are platforms in which you can reach some of these audiences. Is that what you're saying? And what's the difference between that and influence?
If you were to look at, thank you. If you were to look at, for instance, let's look at a tool like Klout, where it will measure things like where a person carries the most engagement and interaction.
Sure.
Would you value those interactions on those platforms differently? Would you weigh them differently when it comes to calculating that context of that influence?
So I think there's a couple different things, and this is where this topic gets very interesting, is a lot of people have beaten those tools up today because they're looking for overall online influence, right? Or they're looking for, how does my online influence tie to my offline influence? What I'm proposing is purely that when you find that you have an audience on a platform, a Facebook, a Twitter, whatever it may be, the question is as a business, how do I efficiently reach them, right? How do I efficiently use that platform? And so the tools that are out there today are typically generic pieces. They measure activity, and it's only part of the story. You know, as we know, social is about relationships, and the reality is that we're still in the infancy stage of figuring all this out. And so I guess the biggest takeaway I have from this talk is don't put your eggs all in one basket. You know, don't jump on the next big thing and say everything's about a score, because that's not the whole story. It's just not today. So.
And we had one more question, actually. It's a little bit from Sorry, I'm just trying to load everything up. Nicholas Chan at Nick Mike Chan. And he said he saw one of your interests is the MBA. Perhaps he saw that on Klout. And he wants to know what you thought of the first MBA Social Media Awards.
I did not. I vaguely paid attention, but I can't say that I know much about it. I mean, I saw, but actually it's interesting. So one of my interests in being MBA, I watch the MBA channel a lot. I didn't see who won, but I find the most interesting thing, I live in Portland, Oregon, and so the Portland Trailblazers are there, and a lot of those guys are on Twitter, and I'll tweet back and forth with them. And man, they've been media trained not to interact with the public because these guys have their own little world and their own little clique, and they've been just totally PR trained not to interact with anybody. So I find a lot of these interests that I have, I watch, and some I build relationships in. So.
There you go. Does anybody have any more questions that you'd like to tweet at SoMix2012? Let me just pull up my screen. Yes. Oh, we can take questions from the audience too if you're not able to tweet at us. Does anyone have any questions for Matt? Yes, at the back.
Do you guys constantly publish your research as you're going, or is it all just for whatever companies you're working with?
Yeah, so the challenge with our company is that, I don't want to say this. So my co-founder Nitin's been studying this for about 6 or 7 years. And unlike a normal academic, he hasn't published his research for a reason, because we knew we wanted to create this company. And the challenge with the market is today is that a lot of the models that are out there today that exist, you know, social network analysis, graph theory, information theory, all these different things, they were never built for social media. And yet we're applying them to social media. And so what Nitin has done is gone off and filled a gap that he's identified in the market about how social networks actually work. And so, yeah, we haven't published it because it's a pretty tightly held IP secret for us. So, yeah.
Klout, is that a measurable metric or just popularity?
I almost got out of here without an answer to that question, didn't I? Wow.
Why waste my time?
That's a great question. So in my opinion, Klout is a measure of your individual activity. And so when you look at it, and I know people that make a living out of helping people game their score because other people are using it, right? So I think when you step back to the first thing which I talked about, which was context, Klout does nothing with context. And so as a business trying to really figure out what's important and what's not, you have to start with context. So the person with the highest Klout score is Justin Bieber. He has a perfect Klout score, right? Great. How many of you in your business would like Justin Bieber to tweet something about you so your audience actually gives a crap? Is there, I mean, there probably are people in here, but not many of us, right? So to me, that falls down there immediately. But I think that the bigger thing is that people that have been in an audience, so the last graph that I showed you, we actually laid Klout scores over the top of it, and they're all over the place. So when you put it in a context, it starts to fall apart pretty quickly. So I'm sure lots of people have lots of opinions on that. So.
Any more questions for Matt? I feel like there's some hands that are almost there. Anybody?
It's okay, yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, businesses already have some issues leveraging and kind of getting their head around from a resource point of view,
Yeah.
social in general.
Yep.
And I mean, I completely agree with kind of the importance of influence, but how do we realistically leverage this, you know, this month, this year? And what does it actually mean from an actual sort of baby step point of view?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the question was, how do we actually make this actionable, right? I mean, how do we do this in a real way? So the reason I'm so passionate about this is I knew social media was valuable, but I got my butt kicked constantly by my CEO going, what in the hell are we doing? Why are we doing this? What revenue did you provide, right? And it's a long road. And the problem is when you're an early adopter, even now today, it's still a long road to show value, right? The ROI question is still tough. And that's because people don't realize, the reason I put those slides up there is people don't realize we have to build that asset, which is your network of relationships, and that's an investment. Forget about the campaigns that we know how to run and measure and everything else, because if you think about it, Google says, pay me for your AdWords, and I'm going to show you the output. Well, that's a real easy metric to measure, right? So how do you do this today, kind of what I was alluding to, the different behaviors? I don't have a good answer for you today, and that was the challenge of this presentation. In the next 6 months, you'll have a really good answer. And it will change the way you look at things, I promise you. But I wish I had a better answer for you today. I didn't want to make it into something I couldn't deliver on, so I was trying to make it generic. So.
Great, thank you so much.
Okay.
Oh, was there another question? Did I miss it?
One over there.
Oh, right.
If you have time, sorry.
Oh, yes.
Can you speak on maybe the difference between measuring the social relevance versus a back end like a HubSpot that uses math and science to send out messages?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple different things here, right? When we look at a lot of different things that are using different analytics and different measurements, they're looking at the aggregate, right? They're looking at things which say, if you think about the tools that we have today, we see a lot of content, and if you watch, any of you use Radian 6 or any of these other tools, you see, what graphs you get are you see trends of activities or transactions over time, right? And so based on those patterns, you're trying to say, well, in the future, this is the right time to do that. And in general, it might be right. The challenge becomes when you start to really look at it as a form of relationships and how people interact, because those relationships change constantly, right? Those pictures I showed you don't look like that today. Like individuals change their preferences, they change their relationships. And so the metrics that we have today give you good indicators to understand that community, but the problem is there's still a gap, right? There's still a gap in understanding relationships and how information moves around those relationships. Those metrics really just help you form a mental model and get better at it, but I think there's still a gap between that and actually truly getting to a place where we can efficiently do this, so. All right. Thank you.
I'd like to officially thank you. Thank you, Matt, so much.
Thank you. Thanks. Appreciate it.